Hi, my name is Tony McLaughlin from Citibank Transaction Services, and today we are talking payments with Michael Salmony. Michael, great to see you. Would you just start by telling us, who you are, what you do, and what you're interested in at the moment?
Sure. My name is Salmony. I'm executive advisor to the board at equensWorldline, which is currently the largest payments provider in Europe. And after our hopefully upcoming merger with Ingenico, we will be the fourth largest in the world. So we have a very big interest in payments, especially in Europe and increasingly globally.
Yeah, absolutely. You seem to be very acquisitive these days. You've snapped up some relatively big players.
Well, that's the name of the game now. Payments is very much a scale business, and so it's good to be able to leverage that.
So what are the topics on your mind at the moment in the European payments landscape and wider? How do you see the payments landscape emerging as a result of the crisis?
Well, there are the sort of obvious ones, not necessarily related to payments, that just digitization is getting a big boost right now. Right? We see that we're meeting everybody with Zoom, or we have to work out which of the 17 different online meeting platforms we should be using. So there's obviously a need for consolidation there. But regarding payments and digitization, it is an absolute joy to see, for example, that some topics which have been absolutely impossible to move, for example, less cash in Germany, just to take one example, now seems to be really possible, right? We've had an enormous jump in contactless payments in Germany. So we can see that in terms of crisis, and that modern technologies sometimes get a huge push.
Absolutely. The limit in the UK just was increased from £30 to £45. Is similar things are happening on the continent?
Well, absolutely. You may have seen that the EPC did a survey across the whole of Europe, and in fact, almost every country is doubling the limits. And I think we're quite fortunate in Europe because we have a very good infrastructure here. And we also sort of culturally, I think, quite in tune with digitization. But there are some surprising differences. For example, at the moment, I'm quite involved with Japan, who always appear as a very technologically advanced nation, which of course they are by and large, but they're one of the cash heaviest nations in the world. They're even 3 times more cash reliant than Germany. And one of the things that they're now encountering is more a cultural problem to do with signatures because they are used to putting stamps on pieces of paper. Hanko, it's called. And so since when you're sitting in remote offices connected via Zoom, you cannot co-sign a contract using Hanko stamps anymore. So they see the need for digitization in digital identity, for example, coming in through that rather curious route.
Absolutely. So I get there is this, I guess, commentary about what the crisis will lead to is more digital everything. But of course, there are viruses in the digital world as well, not just in the physical world. So I just wonder whether or not we will build new vulnerabilities by dashing to digital as a result of the crisis.
I mean, it certainly exposes us to a risk which I think is already part of our world, and that's cybercrime, even more. And there are some people who say the next crisis, not the previous one, which was the financial crisis, nor this one, the virus one, but the next one will actually be due to cybercrime, because the hackers have got so sophisticated and talk to each other and cooperate so intelligently, which we don't always do in the financial services industry. We need to cooperate much better to defend against this. That maybe one of the next causes of a financial crisis may actually be cybercrime. And the more we go digital, and the more gaps we have, for example, not properly doing identity properly, etc., will cause a lot of problems.
Well, I wanted to go back to what you said about the smaller businesses becoming digital. I know that in Germany, for example, there are many restaurants that only accept cash. So there'll be many thousands of businesses that need to get online and accept electronic payments, both face-to-face, ultimately through contactless payments, and also online. Your company is a massive player in that space. So are you seeing that kind of influx of demand? Do you have programs in place to help smaller businesses accept payments?
I think there's a huge slew of programs, not only from our company, but from the government, from the regulators, to try and accelerate the move to digitization. We don't want to be so dependent on physical location where people are, physical things like cash, etc. So I do see a huge move, but it's not only in the retail space. I think also in the B2B space, which I always think we talk far too little about in the payment area. How do you fully electronify and distribute those processes? For example, if you have multiple people who need to sign off on a treasury release of the salary payments for a huge corporate, how do you do that when people are sitting in home offices, maybe in not very secure environments without any chip card readers? And so how do you do multi-signatory processes, or how do you do e-treasury when people are working from home? I think these are going to be the real challenges now, not only the retail, but how to actually transform the whole of the businesses.
So really reimagining these workflows and enabling them to cope with remote working and digital signing, essentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A banker I was talking to recently was saying, we're used to having about 1,000 people in home office, and that's fine, we can manage that well. What does a bank look like when we have 100,000 people in home office? Maybe for a long time. And, maybe they're connected via some slightly dodgy broadband in some remote village, and they don't have the security they have at home. They don't have a Bloomberg terminal at home either. How can they continue to do their work? And I think that raises some really interesting questions, which goes way beyond us just connecting via Zoom instead of all jumping on the plane all the time.
Yeah. Now, I'm intrigued by this notion of things that people talked about for ages that crises actually bring into actuality. And it's in particular in the European context. What do you think will the crisis bring into the world that's been talked about for a long time? Is this going to create European central bank digital currency, this European payments initiative to have a European scheme, maybe a pan-European federated ID initiatives? What's going to accelerate and actually happen, come out of the talking shops and get into reality as a result of the crisis?
I mean, I'm not so sure whether to pick up at the topics that you mentioned, whether the CBDC will get an acceleration. I think that's driven by other factors, quite honestly. And I think all the questions that are raised with that, will that cause a bank run, and what will happen to commercial banks if central banks start issuing their own money? I think those are the main questions which are probably not impacted that much by COVID, I would have said. However, the idea that we in Europe need a pan-European scheme, I think is, after all, is still a very good idea. And we're also seeing in PSD2 and open banking where Europe leads the world, after all. I mean, that's kind of nice. Usually we import things from California or from China, so it's kind of nice to have something where the Europeans are really good at, which they could then maybe export to others. So an open banking scheme, which doesn't just consist of plonking an API there, but actually covering the whole of the problem space, like how do you manage disputes and how do you manage fraud and how do you do branding, all the things there. So a European scheme is surely still very important. And another thing that Europe, I think, may be leading the world is privacy. And that, to me, is another really key thing that is getting a lot of attention, rightly, during the crisis. We're starting to do apps which are tracking us, which might help monitor who's talking to who. And some have some concerns about the privacy implications of that. So I think it's really good that people are thinking more about privacy, and maybe Europe, with its leading role there, can help.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable that in this context, the privacy concerns are so much in the forefront of the discussion, whereas you could argue that from a public health perspective, a bit more of a draconian approach would be justified just to keep people safe and alive. So yeah, I think you're right. Europe, through GDPR, certainly has raised the awareness of the need for informed consent.
Yes. Yes, I would actually see some of that a little bit the other way around, quite honestly. I mean, maybe I've lived in Germany for too long, but people are very sensitive to privacy here, right? Extremely sensitive. I think it's one of the few countries which basically didn't allow Google Street View and things, right? So because people are very, very sensitive about privacy. And all of a sudden we have this COVID app where all sorts of data is now being gathered, and people seem to be quite relaxed about it and think it's a good idea. So it's amazing how when you see the usefulness of something and the utility, that you sometimes get a really quick mindset change, which of course is much more difficult than just a technology change or a business set. How do you get a mindset and a culture change going?
Yeah,
that's why the crisis, I think, has been really accelerating and helpful.
Yeah, I guess it's changed behaviours on a whole spectrum of human activity, and it's remarkable how quickly people kind of adapt to this. I hate this phrase "new normal." I don't think it's new, and I don't think it's it's normal. But we're an adaptable species, and we're adopting things that we're so far kind of niche interests are becoming very, very widespread. But I also did want to ask you.
Sorry, I was just wondering what you were thinking. What are going to be the sort of temporary changes, and what are going to be the lasting ones, right? I mean, for example, is this that we hardly travel anymore? We do everything by Zoom, and it seems to work quite well. Will that be a new normal? And we will genuinely sort of reduce 90% of our business travel, or will that go away? I think some of those, the answers aren't clear yet. Huh?
They're not clear yet, but I do also think that we can bounce in both directions fairly quickly. When needs must, we can stay at home for a few months, and then once the shackles are released, we'll be back on the planes again and on the beaches in Mallorca. So I think we'll flip fairly rapidly when circumstances change.
I certainly can't wait to go to the pub again.
Absolutely, I'll join you there. And in fact, that's another thing I wanted to ask you in terms of how your lifestyle is at the moment. When things go back to, in inverted commas, normal, what will be the thing that you would like to maintain from your current lifestyle, rather than just go back to the old ways?
I mean, this less traveling is certainly something. I've been a very intensive traveler, and I've always been, quite honestly, a little bit skeptical of these video conferences, and they are not as good as meeting somebody face to face. But now that everybody's become so used to it and the technology's become so mature that it almost works really well, the sound quality is good, the video works instantly. You still can't quite see the nuances of people's faces, especially if there's several people around the table. But that's something I would really like us to keep, right? Not only for the environment and for our personal well-being. I think that's really great. And of course, if sort of contactless shoots up more, we use more digital payments. Maybe we start using digital identity and identifying each other more reliably. If these things get a big push, if we get a pan-European scheme going, if all these things happen, so be it. Excellent. Yeah.
Well, Michael, it's been delightful to talk to you. And I'll see you in the pub after the crisis is finished. Thank you very much.
It's a date. Pleasure talking to you, Tony.
You too. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.